Okay, so today I'm doing a video on what I think I'm going to call the evolutionary biology of farm animals, though it may not be exactly what you think. This isn't my idea. I picked this up from someone else, a fellow named Jean-Francois Guérepy, I believe I'm pronouncing that close to right. And he used this as an argument. He was involved in this debate with this fellow, and the video of the debate is, I think, like 3 hours long or something. But then I actually watched the video in which Jean-Francois did almost like line by line dissection of his debating strategy and tactics. And that video is like almost 4 hours long. So it's just because this is a really interesting idea, and it's sort of buried in here. And I don't know how many people are going to watch these multi-hour videos and maybe miss out on this idea. So I thought I'd make what I hope will be a shorter video. And the other thing is that he doesn't provide any of the in a sort of systematic way, doesn't lay out the theoretical underpinnings of the idea that he's putting forward. So I thought that maybe two birds, one stone, maybe make the video shorter, more accessible that way, and also make it more accessible in terms of laying out the groundwork, the sort of theoretical groundwork that underpins what he was saying. So, anyways, I'll put a link below to his video if you want to get the long version. But for those who want the short version, or shorter anyways, here we go. So there's before I launch into it, then there's like four key ideas. Well, really three, but there's a fourth sort of tangential idea, which maybe isn't so important for what I'm going to say today, but worth mentioning. And then four sort of key ideas from evolutionary biology, behavioral ecology, that are valuable for understanding this idea that I'm going to present to you momentarily. Okay, so I'm just looking. The light isn't so good. Yeah, I have to get better lighting. I know I have to get better lighting, but this is what the situation is at the moment. This is what was available. So this is what we're going. I will get better lighting, I think. All right. So the ideas that we want to take. So first is the idea of the selfish gene, and hopefully a lot of people watching this will already be familiar with that idea, but I know that not everyone will. And furthermore, even worse, I know some people will think they understand it and really don't understand it. So I actually had the thought I should just make a video just on the selfish gene, right? And then whenever I want to make another video, because pretty much for almost everyone I make here, it's going to be important to understand the selfish gene. So I can just say, go watch that video first, and then come back and watch this one. Except that, they probably won't do that. So I'll just, have to preface it each time. And, it takes different emphases maybe are relevant in each context. So maybe it's worth doing it each time. I don't know. Anyways, so the point of the selfish gene, then, if you're not familiar with the idea, the phrase coined by Richard Dawkins, the idea, sometimes called the gene's eye view, is a much older idea, but Dawkins coined this clever phrasing. And the idea is that it's kind of a heuristic, kind of a shorthand, that if you engage in a certain kind of thought experiment, you can improve your intuitions about how evolution works. And the idea then is to think of evolution in terms of genes having a motivation, of having desires, and hold on a second, just have to change something here, right? Of genes having desires and having motivations. And the primary motivation that the genes have is to be immortal, to live forever. And all the multicellular, and for that matter, even single cellular, but we're talking about multicellular creatures today, so I'll just emphasize that. All these multicellular organisms, like us, exist to the extent that over long evolutionary time, they've proven to be effective vehicles for allowing this perpetuation of genes, for allowing genes to be effectively immortal. as they pass from generation to generation to generation. So multicellular organisms are the product of structures and behaviors which are generated by genes. Now, of course, in the real story here, what's happening is that these particular structures and behaviors have proven successful at allowing their reproduction in future generations. But you can think of it from the perspective that the genes are trying to build technologies, that we are in fact technology for helping genes move forward, and they're always trying to come up with the better structure and the better behavior that will make us as a form of technology for their perpetuation to be more effective. So this is the basic idea of the selfish gene, but what's relevant for what I want to say today, and often people get confused, is the emphasis on the idea of selfish. Some people have, ever since Dawkins first published that book back in '76, people have misinterpreted the selfish as implying that we ourselves, our genes make us selfish. Now, there's an element of truth to that, but on the face of it, I mean, humans can be very cooperative and very, very altruistic, right? The emphasis isn't on that. The emphasis, or at least the emphasis I want to place on it here, is the idea that the genes are selfish in relationship to us, right? They don't care if we're happy. They don't care if we're healthy or if we're content. None of these things matter to our genes. All that matters is that we're good vehicles, that we're effective technology for allowing them to be immortal, to be continually replicated in the future generations. That's all they care about in terms of, care, right? This in this thought experiment, right? So, so now, as it turns out, being healthy and happy is pretty good for reproduction, but it doesn't have to be. If it turned out that being miserable and unhealthy were the more successful way, the more effective strategy for genes to get into future generations, that would be the technology that would come to prevail. That would be the technology in a sense that the genes would choose, the selfish genes would choose. Hold on a second. Okay, so I'm sorry, I had a bit of a technical problem there, but I think I'm back, so we'll continue. So the genes are selfish in relationship to us, right? They don't care about us any more than whether we're effective forms of technology for advancing their replicatory interests, right? So that's the first idea. Second idea, the idea that of symbiotic relationships form between species, and so different animals, or to be precise, the genes of different animals producing the technology that are these different species, sometimes develop a symbiotic relationship where they mutually support each other in terms of their evolutionary fitness. And so there's lots of examples of these kind, and sometimes interesting examples of these kind of symbiotic relationships. But the most famous, or the most common, I think, probably also the most famous, is feeding examples. So there are, for instance, animals where it's usually a smaller animal and a bigger one, and the smaller one will eat parasites or ticks or different things that get onto the body of the larger animal, and at least make the life of the larger animal uncomfortable, and can even constitute health threats to it. So there's these famous examples of cleaner fish. There's all different species of cleaner fish, these small little fish that will clean off the big fish, clean the parasites off them. There's different kinds of birds that will land on different kinds of mammals like zebras and sort of eat ticks off of them and sort of thing, right? So there's a symbiotic relationship here. On the one hand, the larger animal, the one who's providing the buffet or the plate, I suppose, is benefiting from having these things removed from its body, which are at least an irritant and maybe even worse. On the one hand, and the smaller animal who's doing the eating is getting its food, getting its dinner from it, right? So the two sort of have this nice sort of symbiotic relationship, right? If it ended, each would suffer in some way, right? So that's one idea. This idea of symbiotic relationships are sort of out there. They naturally evolve, right? Okay. The third thing, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but it's worth, or I don't intend to. Who knows how this will really go? The third thing is that it's always a mistake, and people make this mistake all the time, to think that humans are not natural. Right? Anything humans, so we almost distinguish between over on this side is what humans do, and over here is natural. We call what's natural that which is untouched by humans. Right? Well, this is crazy talk, right? I mean, humans are natural. We're a product of evolution, like everything else. We're just as much a part of nature as everything else. And what we do is just a part of nature, right? I mean, high-rise office buildings and nuclear power plants and the new chemical compounds that we create, synthesize, right? I mean, these are no less a part of nature than a beaver's dam or a bird's nest, right? I mean, it's crazy to think this way, and yet it's common. So that's not important for the point I'm going to make here, but it's something to keep in mind. And the fourth thing I want to emphasize is what's called eusociality, or eusocial reproduction. And it's basically the letters EU before the word social, right? Eusocial. So eusocial reproduction is a situation in which, and this is the famous example of this, the one that people will usually think of, and it's been studied a lot, is the case of Hymenoptera, particularly ants and bees. And this is where they live in like colonies, but the vast majority of the, virtually all, of the members of the colony don't themselves physically, as individual organisms, reproduce. Rather, they have what we call a queen, which is kind of a weird term. I think probably I've heard it said that really what the queens really are the ovaries of the colony. That's just, essentially what they are, right? They're the ones that do the actual sexual reproducing, right? And this includes reproducing the worker bees or the worker ants or whatever. You do the various tasks to sustain the colony or the hive, but they also are reproducing their own continual lineage of queens into the future, right? So just to emphasize here, of course, the general explanation for this behavior has usually been based in genetics, and the fact that these Hymenoptera we were just talking about are hapdips. So like you think of humans, your humans are diploids. So both our parents have two of each chromosome. And we get one of each chromosome from them, but the one we get is not one that they have. They actually, their body, their gonads reproduce one. It takes the two existing ones they have and constructs a third one that we get. So the genes come from, all the genes on the chromosome we get from our mother come from our mother, but the chromosome doesn't exist in our mother, right? It's a completely new chromosome, but the genes all come from her, right? But there's a 50-50 chance that we get, any one allele from either side of the two chromosomes, right? Which is why we tend to think of ourselves as being more or less 50% related to our siblings, because there's a 50-50 chance that we got the same allele from, the same chromosome. And this is true of our mother and fathers. These Hymenoptera are hapdips, and that the mother are diploids, so that process happens on the mother's side, but the fathers are haploids, which means they only have one chromosome of each, and so the offspring get that chromosome. So while each sibling has a 50-50 chance of having the same gene as the mother, they have a 100% chance of having the same gene as the father. So the siblings end up being like 75% related to each other. So it's often thought that this was the explanation of why it would be evolutionarily sustainable, that you'd have the overwhelming majority, virtually all, basically, of the individuals in evolutionary terms, willing to sacrifice reproduction to support the reproduction of one other member of their group, the queen. But it's turned out that it's not that simple. that other factors play a role. And among those factors is having a controlled, pretty safe environment and easy access to food. And the hypothesis was put forward actually by Richard Alexander, I think was the first to put forward this hypothesis, that if you find the right conditions, you should find eusociality among other kinds of animals. And in fact, it has been found among others. I think the first mammal that was found was the naked mole rat, which I believe lives in Africa. And it's the same kind of thing because they live in these tunnels, these underground tunnels, very secure. They have easy access to food, and they've developed eusociality. So they essentially have queens that do all the reproduction, and the rest of the moles, are doing things just like the worker bees or the worker ants or whatever, doing things to sort of sustain the colony and keep the environment ideally conducive for the success of the queen in terms of reproduction. So, and others have come in, including other mammals, have been found that are eusocial. Right, so you don't need the 75%. The hap dip thing is really valuable. You can see why that would be valuable in that kind of arrangement, but it's not the sole condition that you have to look at when you're thinking in terms of eusociality. Okay, so with those 4 ideas in mind, selfish genes, right, and the emphasis here being selfish in relationship to the technology they build to reproduce themselves, right? They don't care if you're happy. If you're happy and that turns out to be fitness enhancing, great, but they don't care, right? All they care about is that you're good at getting them into future generations, allowing them to be immortal, right? Symbiosis between species becomes possible for 2 species to have a relationship that's mutually beneficial to each other. This, getting rid of this silly idea that humans, are not a part of nature, and what they produce is not part of nature, and so forth. And then this idea of eusociality, that under the right conditions, a species can become eusocial, that is, they focus its reproductive energy on one or a handful of individuals, where the ovaries of the group, as it were, and the others become effectively or literally sterile, and work on behalf of maintaining the right environment for the queens to be able to be effective reproducers. Right? So, with that in mind, then, the point that Jean-Francois was making, and I'm just going to read, I wrote down a version of it here. So, what has happened then with farm animals? I'm just going to talk about chickens here, but what I say about chickens is true of cows and pigs and whatever, right? Okay, anywhere where the conditions I describe here apply, it's true. I'm just going to talk about chickens, which is the example that he uses when most of the time, in his video. So, what has happened then between chickens and humans? Now, from a human perspective, you may tell the story as, well, humans caught these birds that were, turned out to be conducive to being domesticated, and then we started selectively breeding them as a food source, and whatever, right? But from the perspective of the evolutionary point of view, taken seriously, the genetic interest of the chickens, what we have in the farm relationship is a situation where a symbiotic relationship has evolved between humans and chickens, such that the chickens have become highly successful eusocial reproducers. So, from the chicken's point of view, or from the genes, the selfish genes of the chicken point of view, right? We've sort of gradually, humans seem to have sort of gradually identified the chickens that produce the best chickens for us to eat, or the best eggs for us to eat, that we find most pleasurable, nutritious, pleasant, But from the perspective of the chickens, those have, through the evolutionary forces, because humans are a part of nature, and what we do is part of the forces of nature. So this element of the force of nature that humans represent has created certain pressures upon chicken evolution, such that now certain queens have been identified who are effectively, and sperm, in another case of sperm too, of males. Hold on, just have to readjust this. My foot's going to sleep. All right. Um, and in sperm of males have these individuals and sort of the kings and queens of the chicken colony. And this is true, by the way, you're thinking of in terms of an individual farm, where individual farmers make an individual choice of which chicken to keep, and which to use for food and which to use for reproduction, sort of thing, or whether you're talking at industrial farming levels. It's the same process that's happening in both cases, right? So these individuals with the best genes from the human perspective, are the ones that effectively, as a result of the evolutionary pressures created by the natural forces that are human preferences, have become the queens. And they're particularly successful because, unlike they would have in the natural environment, they have an extremely protected habitat thanks to human interaction, human intervention, and they have a ready supply of food thanks to human intervention. Precisely the two of the key conditions that Alexander said we had to look for if we wanted to find eusocial animals that eventually led to the discovery of the naked mole rat. So these conditions are arising in nature because of human activity. Human action is creating these conditions which have turned these into eusocial reproducers. Now, the vast majority, same as with the ants and the bees and the mole rats, right? The vast majority of those born to these queens or kings never reproduce themselves. And in the case of chickens, right, they become food for humans. But they're still doing the same job in the same way that the worker ants or the worker bees mold the environment, or the naked mole rat, naked mole rat, non-reproducers are molding the environment to make it as conducive for the success of their queen to reproduce. So are the individual chickens and eggs that end up never reproducing, because they're serving as food to humans, and that food is the inducement that the humans need or require or accept as the conditions to create the secure environment and the plentiful food supply that is beneficial to the continual reproduction of the kings and the queens. Right? And you might think, oh, it's just so terrible for the chickens. I mean, I understand why you think that, but from the perspective of the genes of the chicken, the genes of the queen chicken, or the king, in the case of the sperm of the cows, that is used to inseminate, right? From the perspective of the genes in those animals, great, because that's all they wanted, right? That's their selfish desire, is to continually replicate. And humans have created the opportunity for them to be able to do this under ideal conditions. No threat from predators, shelter, continuous source of food, medical attention if they get sick. Where do they find that in the rest of non-human nature? Where do you find medical attention when you get sick, right? These are extraordinary, safe, secure, productive environments for the genes of these animals. And of course, that's what evolution is all about. It's all about these genes. So I thought that was a pretty interesting argument. I never heard anyone make that argument. It makes a lot of sense when you put it, in this context. I'm not saying it's perfect. I mean, I'm sure there's holes, and I look forward in the comments below for people to shoot, poke holes in it or whatever. But I think it's a pretty interesting argument. Anyway, as I said, this is a little shorter than Jean-Francois's videos, so maybe it will, get into more people's hands. If nothing else, I think it's a great inducement to trying to think through the logic of evolutionary relationships, because it's very common for people to say, yeah, I'm for evolution, without understanding it at all. And so the better we can sort of provoke people to try and use evolutionary thinking when they think about the world in general, that's probably a good idea. All right, so that's that. Like, share, whatever. It's always appreciated. That's it. Over and out for now. Thanks. Bye.